So I was thinking the other day, what does YouTube need more of? Poker vlogs. Great drone shots, great footage, high octane action. So without further ado, I'm throwing my hat in the ring. Let's get into vlogging. I'm just kidding. We're not going to be doing any of that. But we are going to be having fun looking at some hands played from a recent live session that I played over at Orange City. Without further ado, let's jump into it and start talking some strategy on some live poker hands. Alright, so this is very early on in the session, playing 1-2 with a 200 max buy, so I have 200 to start. There is going to be a limp from early position, and he is a older, quieter guy that just sat down fairly recently. Very, very nice gentleman. We end up tangling later in the session as well, but he's going to limp for 2. We have pocket 8s and decide to attack for 11. Pretty standard sizing, not really much reason to go too much larger. Again, it's earlier in the session. I don't have tons of reads at this point, so I'm just kind of going with default sizing until I get some more info. End up getting called from a later position player as well, and the limp calls. Not too shocking, especially for the 11 sizing. If I went for like 20 or something like that, I don't think I get that limp call every single time, but I digress. So we end up going to a 7-5-5 with 2 diamonds flop. There is a check from the early position limper. And we decide to c-bet for 15, which I think is fine. Probably a little bit small for live. This could probably be like 20 or 24, something like that. Still get enough second best calls. We're really looking to get called by like those small limp called pocket pairs, deuces, fours, that kind of stuff. Any 7x hand, diamonds, all that kind of fun stuff. So I end up getting called. Turn is the 3 of hearts. It does fill up 4-6, but I'm not overly concerned about 4-6 at this point. And we end up firing for 27 on the turn. Probably could have been just a hair larger, but honestly, 35 is probably the max I can go. If he check raises, we're just in a terrible spot. But luckily, he just ends up check calling. River, unfortunately, is the 7 of clubs, and just not a great card in the slightest. If he had any 7x, which is very reasonable, definitely going to be probably seeing something exactly like this. He ends up firing, and we quickly let this one go. I just don't see enough like busted diamonds or anything firing around like this, or hanging around every single time. I just don't think this is bluffy often enough. I mean, if it is, good for him. He ended up admitting to me later in the session that he did end up having a 7 here. Maybe he's bluffing me. I don't know. But I give him credit for having a 7 here nonetheless. I just don't think this is going to be enough bluffs. And if we get check raised on the turn, it's a really terrible spot, but likely he has the 5. But once he takes this line of check call, just lead out for 100, I think we're looking at the 7. So wrap it up, move on, and go on to the next hand. A little bit later in the session, we are dealing with a straddle on the button. And when button straddles here, the small blind is the first act. So we'll end up looking down 7 of spades, 9 of spades. I like hands like this very, very much. And for whatever reason, decide I don't want to get this hand in focus, but that's okay. So end up limping behind. Not the kind of game where there's a tremendous amount of attacking, like at all. There's been a decent amount of straddling, especially button straddling, but very little attacking. So I don't see too much reason to make this super huge right now. Just given stack sizes and the way the game is playing. And also, I really want to get involved with the big blinds, who has been newer to the table, very, very fun guy, nice to chat with, and definitely want to get involved in quite a few pots with him. So flop, bottom pair, and an open-ended straight draw, end up firing. Just pretty much in situations like this, if you end up picking up equity, very, very good just in general in these kind of free play or cheap pots like this that are limp like this. Very good just to fire off. I did a complete podcast episode about that I will link to in the description box down below, but definitely worth when you pick up decent equity in limped or free pots that you pretty much end up attacking them a good chunk of the time. Don't just let everyone actualize their equity for cheap. Instead, you take control of the pot and fire off and go from there. And I just fired for half pot, 15 into 30, which I think is going to get the job done a decent chunk of the time. So as played, the turn is the 6 of clubs. They check, and I decide to check behind. This is just one of those where if we think about what they likely have, like a lot of like 1 pair hands or possibly a pair plus 9 like I have, I'm probably not going to get a tremendous amount of second best to continue. So at this point, it just makes a lot of sense to check, under-rep my hand, induce bluffs from them. Yes, occasionally they'll have something like Queen Jack, 9 will catch on the river and I'll get kicked to the teeth for it, but I block a 9 whatever, and also I just allow him to possibly bluff on rivers, which is really good, or possibly get a little bit stickier on a check call on the river. So that's kind of the way that I'm going to take this hand. I don't really see firing really anything more than 20 and getting action from anything I also don't see him check raise bluffing very often either. So just go for the check behind, and we're trying to get some value on the river. He checks pretty quickly. It's a 4 of clubs, and we decide to fire off. And we just fire for 75, and he folds before I can even get the bet cut out. So just one of those where not the most exciting hand by any stretch, but I think the discussion of the turn fire is important, and also why we don't fire that turn. And also on the river, why did I choose such a large bet of 75 into roughly a 60 pot, is simply because if he's going to continue, I think he's going to be max in elastic, and I don't really think he's going to bluff check raise, whether I go for something like 40 or go for something like 75. If he's going to call with one pair, I think he'll call 75 roughly the same frequency he calls 40, and as such, betting the larger number is just going to be better against this individual. So that's the way that I thought about that hand. Ended up winning it, which is always awesome. And let's go on to the next hand. Just a little bit later into the session, this is against the exact same villain from the 8-8 hand from earlier. He is in middle position, folds around. Actually, that guy must have limped. Yeah, he limps. Our friend raises to 7. I decide to 3-bet here to 26 because 3-betting queens here is 100% standard. Really don't see any reason to flat and try to create a multi-way pot with queens with no initiative. That's going to be very bloated and not so great. So just go for the default 3-bet and go from there. End up getting called. Flop is 10-8-6 with 2 hearts. And he leads into me for 50. So this is just one of those gross situations where what are we really going to do? Not going to fold. I don't really want to call and have to play like really bloated turns just because what turn am I really going to look for? Am I really going to fold on any turn? Like, I don't see any of that. If he has something like jacks right now or pocket nines, he's trying to figure out where he is. Like, again, do I really want to call, let an overcard pop off, and all of a sudden I lose my chance of getting all that money in right this moment? And if he has pocket tens, is he really going to lead here? Maybe pocket tens or pocket eights or something like that. But I don't think overall I really have much choice other than just to raise. And given kind of the size of the pot right this moment, do I really want to raise to like 140? It doesn't really make any sense. It's pretty much all in anyway. I don't want to click it back. So I'm just going to take a moment, think about it, and end up putting the entire thing in. Again, what other option do I have here? So it's just kind of a bloated pot. He did fire for almost pot here, 50 into 55. Like, just kind of is what it is. And he calls very quickly and ends up showing me kings, and obviously not much I can do at this point, just simply is what it is. You know, from his point of view, I think it's important to kind of look and see how good his play is, and sure, it absolutely punishes me when I happen to have something like jacks or sticky 10, queens, exactly like I have, but ultimately he loses the full of it, and when I happen to have the biggest hands, and doesn't really make too much extra any other time. He'll probably make a lot more money by checking. If he thinks that I'm bluff 3-betting a decent chunk, then, you know, allow me to bluff c-bet, and then you can capture that. I don't really see the line he took being best unless it's exactly the hand or possibly one other combo that I might have here. So I think ultimately worked out in his favor. He did ask later if he was going to be on the vlog. Yes, congratulations, you got on it. It just is what it is. And unfortunately with queens, I can't come up with another line here, so that's the one I take. If you would take another line, please make sure to leave a comment down below. Let me know what you would do, but ultimately, I think I'm fine with my line as it stands right this moment. Now, let's get on to the next hand. Just a little bit later in the session, we're in this hand over here. There's a limp. Actually, 2 limps. And then we decide to attack to 15 with queens. Totally standard, really no question. Size at this point, 15 seemed to be doing the job. Didn't really seem to need to go to 20 or anything like that. So up to 15 we go. End up getting called by the player next to us in the cutoff. And both of the limpers decide to limp fold. Excellent. All right. Flop is interesting. So it is queen 5 deuce rainbow, and I decide to check here. I just think he's more likely to make betting mistakes than calling mistakes, given the way that he's been playing so far. Fairly new to the table, but that's the way I went with it. Turn is a 4, end up firing for 20, and end up getting called. So I want to pause here and leave you with a quick pro tip of what's going through my head on the turn when I get called. I'm saying in my head, hey, let that river card be a 3. Why? Simply because when you're holding a flush draw and you ask for that next card to be a flush card for you and it never, ever, ever, ever is, shouldn't it work the other way around? And river is a deuce giving me a boat. So obviously going to be value betting at this stage in the game. Fire off for 40 on the river and end up getting called pretty quickly. Show queens, and he is very surprised to see something that strong, and I can't really blame him at this stage in the game. And rock and roll, win a nice little pot from here. Just one of those where the top set is kind of always kind of a tricky one in terms of, do you want to kind of play it more slow? The solvers tend to be pretty on board with taking these a little bit slower, not auto betting them or c betting them. And I think in this situation, that's going to be just fine. It's, rarely going to be a home run pot, but at least you're giving your opponent the chance to make some big mistakes, or at least medium-sized mistakes. Rather than fire the flop and pretty much never get action, you're probably never really getting 3 streets of action unless you have a very, very specific opponent. If I had a very specific opponent, like a really, really big drooler, who I knew I could get like 3 streets of value whenever they held any single pair, obviously different story. That wasn't the case here, so the check on the flop is what I went with. If you have any thoughts, let me know. Otherwise, let's get on to the next hand. Alright, so quite a bit later in the session, we end up in this spot with a button straddle. Small blind decides to call. Big blind with ace queen of hearts. Just raise it up to 20. Wasn't one of those tables where I really needed to go like 25 or 30 in this spot. Totally standard sizing as well, but I thought 20 was going to get the job done plenty enough of the time. End up getting called by the player in the cutoff. Flop is king 7 deuce, giving me a backdoor flush draw. I c-bet for 15. They decide to call. Didn't really seem like a super confident call, just the way that they've been playing. And they also are off of a shorter stack. I check the turn. And they end up firing the whole thing in for 81 total. 82, something like that. So at this point, I start talking them up a little bit. Just trying to figure out what's going on here. Do you want to call? Ask him if he wants a call.
Or not really.
Gives me the old handshake you saw there. Didn't seem super comfortable.
I have no discipline.
So I tell him I have no discipline and flick in the call. So first and foremost, I really like using phrases like I have no discipline and stuff like that. Just makes people feel like, oh, this is someone who's definitely here to play around and splash around, not just trying to, maximize every bit of profit. Although I definitely am trying to maximize some profit, even though hands like this will sometimes speak to the contrary of that. So at this stage in the game, he is only making a pot-sized shove, so it's not like out of the ordinary for this to be a king or something like that. It should be a decent chunk of the time, but based on the way this person had been playing, they hadn't been at the table for too long, sat in with I think like 150 and were down just a little bit. I didn't think that they would fire 80. I didn't think they'd fire all of it with King X. So I thought that the fire was mostly going to be like busted things, draws that hadn't gotten there, anything they were floating with on the flop. And again, that flop call didn't seem extremely comfortable. Now, of course, he can have hands that beat me, 7x, might even do this with something like 8s or 9s he's not comfortable with, or even something like 4s or 5s, same concept. I just didn't think this was going to be enough King X. And once you start removing King X from that possible shove range, then all of a sudden this can be better and better, especially if you think they're ever going to do this with like, I don't know, Ace Queen, Ace Jack, or Jack 10 kind of hands, things like that, backdoor hearts, whatever, and obviously all the kind of club combos that we do just fine against. So end up making the call in this situation, and yeah, just is what it is. Unfortunately, he ended up showing me pocket 5s. River is a queen, which kind of bails me out, which I was quite happy with. Nice to finally have one of those go in my direction. And he was not too thrilled with that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I just kind of thought that he wasn't going to have a tremendous amount of King X. He did end up having pocket 5s. Is what it is. What are you going to do? But it's just one of those spots of It's a really, really nasty spot. And if I was a little bit larger pre-flop, it's a simpler SPR. If I had just fired the flop for bigger, would have been an easier spot. I could have checked the flop as well. There's really a lot of options on the table in this spot. I actually posted this one in the Redshift Discord and got some really interesting feedback on it. Pretty much nobody wanted to check call on the turn, and it is what it is. Sometimes you make a bad call, you end up getting bailed out by it. But really important to think about the forking and if people are going to choose bet sizes differently based upon what they have. So if you think that they fire like 40 with King X, but they wouldn't ever bet 80 with King X, then that was definitely what was going through my head in this particular spot. And I just thought I could find enough calls where getting the pot odds I was getting roughly 2 to 1, it was going to be okay. Unfortunately, ran into fives, but fortunately end up getting there. Now let's move on to the next hand. Getting toward the tail end of the session, we're playing about six-handed at this point. Look down at queens, and did you notice that I've gotten dealt the exact same combo of queens 3 different times this session? I didn't realize that until watching this all back, but that's kind of nuts. Can't really think about the last time something like that's happened. So I ended up getting called by the big blind, who has been playing pretty call-y up to this point. Very little aggression from him. Flop is 8-7-4 with a flush draw. End up firing for 7. Probably a little small against someone like this who would call a little more liberally. Probably could have been something like 10, but not the biggest deal in the entire world. The turn is a really nasty 5 of clubs. Fills up pretty much everything. Check it behind. I do not have the queen of clubs in my hand. River is a 5 of hearts. He checks, and I think at this point this is kind of a mandatory bet. I fire it for 15. Maybe it could have been just a tad larger, but honestly 15 is probably about the most I'm going to get from this individual. And ended up showing him the queens, and he mucks. Probably just call me with an 8 or a 7. Pretty standard. But this is really important, even though it's not the biggest pot in the entire world. This is an important spot to discuss simply because going for that final river bet, a lot of people just check it behind and say, okay, like we're done here. And getting that last little bit of thin value, especially at 1-2, 1-3, 2-5, is extremely, extremely important. And obviously, if you're doing this against better players, like they are going to throw in check raise bluffs and that kind of stuff. But against kind of your average 1-2, 1-3 opponent, even 2-5 opponent, there are tons of times where you can crank out this last little bit of value. If they wanted to bluff, they would not have checked the turn and the river, in my opinion. So when they finally do check that river, they're probably looking at something like one pair that just improved to, a mediocre 2 pair, and you can probably get some value from it. So even though it's a really nasty board, a really nasty turn card, once they go check on turn river, make sure to get that last little bit, and you'd be surprised how often you can get that call. It doesn't need to be huge bets, but honestly, making an extra 15 here, 20 there can go a long way towards improving your overall hourly. So make sure you're on the lookout for those. Again, smaller pot, not the most impressive thing in the world, but important to go for that last bit of value. So without further ado, let's go to the next hand. This final hand of the session, at least major hand of import to look at. Look down at black kings, always fun. Table did fill back up to 8-handed. We do have a straddle on the button from the player right across the table. Small blind ends up calling. There's a limp eventually from that gentleman. Perfect. I ISO to 25 just because the way the game had been playing at that point. Gets snap called by the player to the left of me. Also, one of the reasons why I went 25 as opposed to just 20. Could make the argument for going 30 as well, just for the record, but I thought 25 was going to be just fine. End up getting called by the straddler, and both of the completers and limpers decide to fold. End up going 3-way to the flop. And the flop is interesting because it gives us top sets. So it's king, jack, 6 with 2 diamonds on board. We are first to act, and I decide to c-bet for 40 here. Top set is always an awkward one just because you block out so many of the combinations that you're looking to get action from for a big pot. But by the same token, the way the game had been playing, I think if anyone has a jack, they're calling for 40. I think if they have a king, obviously, and obviously diamond draws too. Could possibly go a little bit larger. Could definitely argue for something like 60, given the way the game was playing, but I did go 40. So end up getting called by the guy across the table, and turn is the queen of spades. And I decide to fire for 100. And it's just one of those where, like, it's not a ton that I can get action from or value from at this point, but by the same token, like, if he has something like sticky kings or obviously queen jack or a pair plus diamond draw, which can make a lot of sense, I definitely want to try to maximize value. If he has ace 10 or 10-9, sucks to be me, but I definitely want to go for max value in this situation. He ends up finding the fold button. It is what it is. I don't really think I could have sized it down to too much more without just giving him like insano odds if he does have a diamond draw. It's just one of those where what are you going to do? Again, top set is just so incredibly awkward. So flop it twice in a session is extremely rare, but it just is what it is. You still have to go for value in this kind of spot. And I think a lot of players would try to trim their turn size down so much, trying to make sure they get value, or worse, check. And against passive opponents, this person was pretty passive overall. I don't see much reason to check and allow him just to check behind and actualize all of his equity for cheap. And I'm not really going to love like a diamond on the river, an ace on the river, a 10 on the river, 9 on the river. Like, I don't love a ton of river cards, and I think that he would call a decent chunk in order to try to see those kind of river cards just the same. So maybe 100 was just a little bit large for him, or maybe he was just mucking around on the flop with something like pocket sevens and just trying to see what he could do and trying to save face with a stall fold on the turn. But it is what it is, and for him, just is kind of a sucky spot for me. Really happy with the way it played out. Again, flop sizing could have been a little bit larger though, and I think I definitely left some money on the table by making that only 40, when again, something like 55, 60 probably would have done a little bit better. But that's the way this hand rolled out, is what it is. And that is going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed, and if you have any comments, feedback, things you want to see more of or less of in content like this going forward, please don't hesitate to leave a comment down below, and of course just a thumbs up if you enjoyed watching content like this in the first place. If you need anything at all, you can always let us know directly over on the Red Chip Poker Discord, redchippoker.com/discord to join for free, and I look forward to seeing you back in a new video shortly. In the meantime, good luck out there, and happy grinding.